Hundreds of people are doing unbelievable things in our country, and sometimes they do it under a blanket almost, undercover.
There is a certain kind of fame that convinces the public they already know everything about a person. Cliff Richard has lived under that kind of fame for almost 70 years. He is the man who sang about summer holidays and young love, the performer whose grin and clean image made him a fixture of British life across 7 decades. But behind the smiling posters and the record sleeves is a story that very few fans ever fully absorbed, a story of poverty, an accusation that nearly destroyed him despite never being charged with anything, and of a private life so quiet and so solitary that it stands in stark contrast to the noise of the stages he filled. Today, at 85, he is still standing, still singing, and still, in many ways, alone. This is the real story of how Cliff Richard got here, and what his life looks like now. Cliff Richard was not born in Britain, and he did not grow up wealthy. He came into the world on October 14th, 1940, in Lucknow, in what was then British India, under the name Harry Roger Webb. His father worked as a catering manager attached to the Indian railway system, a respectable position that gave the family a comfortable, if modest, life. His mother raised him alongside his 3 younger sisters. For the first 7 years of his life, young Harry Webb knew a version of childhood shaped by colonial India, a life that, in hindsight, he would barely remember accurately, because it ended so abruptly. When India gained independence in 1947, the political and social order that had supported thousands of British families collapsed almost overnight. Families like the Webbs faced an impossible decision: stay in a newly independent nation that no longer needed or wanted a colonial administrative class, or return to a country most of them had only heard about from relatives. The Webbs chose to leave. They boarded a ship for the long voyage to England, arriving with only a fraction of what they had once had. There was no comfortable homecoming waiting for them. Britain in the late 1940s was still recovering from the devastation of the Second World War, and a family arriving from India with limited means found itself starting over from almost nothing. They eventually settled into a modest council house, and it was there that real hardship set in. Cliff shared a bedroom with his sisters, and money was so scarce that the family sometimes could not afford a proper evening meal. On more than one occasion, dinner consisted of little more than toast and tea, sweetened with sugar because there was nothing else in the cupboard. This was not a passing rough patch. It was the reality of an immigrant family trying to rebuild an entire life in a country that offered no safety net and very little sympathy. Despite the hardship, Cliff did well enough in school to stay past the minimum leaving age, eventually earning a qualification in English literature. He was also a capable athlete, playing football well enough to represent his county at a junior level. But it was American rock and roll, filtering across the Atlantic through crackling radio broadcasts and imported records, that captured him completely. His parents found the music jarring and lowbrow. Cliff found in it the only thing that felt truly his. When he was 16, his father, despite his own reservations about the music, bought him a guitar. It was a small, almost reluctant gesture of support that would end up changing the trajectory of an entire family's future. Before he was a star, Cliff Richard was a filing clerk in an electronics factory, the same factory where his father worked. It was a placeholder job, something to occupy his hands while his mind stayed fixed on music. He sang in a school vocal group, then briefly with a skiffle outfit, before deciding to start his own band. He originally called the group the Drifters, a name he would later have to abandon once an American group of the same name became internationally famous. At his manager's suggestion, Harry Webb became Cliff Richard, a stage name built for marquee lights rather than a birth certificate. His breakthrough came in the summer of 1958, when producer Nori Permer invited him into Abbey Road Studios. The session was built around a cover song intended to be the single's main attraction, with a lesser-regarded track called Move It tucked onto the other side almost as an afterthought. History had other plans. Move It became the song that mattered. It rocketed up the charts, reaching the runner-up spot on the UK singles chart that autumn, and it is still regarded by many music historians as the record that gave Britain its first authentic homegrown rock and roll voice. From that point forward, Cliff Richard's career moved at a pace few artists ever experienced. He would go on to place more than 60 singles inside the UK top 10, and he holds a rare distinction of scoring hit singles in every decade from the 1950s through the 2000s, a feat matched by almost no one else in popular music history, Elvis Presley included. He picked up multiple Christmas #1 singles, sold well over 200 million records across his career, and was eventually knighted for his services to music and charity. By any conventional measure, Cliff Richard achieved a level of commercial and cultural success that most performers can only imagine. But the image he built, clean-cut, devout, unfailingly polite, carried a hidden cost. It made him beloved. It also made him, decades later, an easy target for a scandal he had no part in creating. In August 2014, Cliff Richard was on holiday in Portugal when he turned on a television and watched, live, as police officers searched his own home that received no warning. He learned what was happening to his property at the same moment as everyone else watching the broadcast, which was filmed in part from a helicopter circling above his apartment complex. The origins of that raid stretch back nearly 3 decades to an allegation involving an event in Sheffield in the 1980s. The claim reached the Metropolitan Police at a moment when British law enforcement was under intense pressure to take historical abuse allegations seriously, following the posthumous revelations about entertainer Jimmy Savile. Under that pressure, the allegation against Cliff Richard was passed along to South Yorkshire Police, who opened an investigation. What happened next became one of the more controversial episodes in the recent history of British journalism and policing. A BBC reporter learned that an investigation existed and that a search of Cliff Richard's home was being planned. In exchange for holding the story until the day of the search, the BBC was given advance notice of the timing, allowing its crew, including a helicopter, to be in position before officers even arrived. The result was that millions of people watched the police search of a private citizen's home unfold live on national television, before that citizen had been arrested, charged, or even formally interviewed in most respects. Cliff Richard denied the allegation immediately, and he never wavered from that denial. For nearly 2 years, the investigation continued without resolution, casting a shadow over every part of his professional and personal life. Finally, in June 2016, the Crown Prosecution Service reviewed all the evidence gathered and announced that there was insufficient evidence to bring any charge whatsoever. Cliff Richard was never arrested. He was never charged. No court ever heard evidence against him, because no formal case was ever built. But the damage caused by 2 years of public suspicion could not be undone by a single official statement. Rather than quietly absorbing the loss to his reputation, Cliff Richard chose to take both the BBC and South Yorkshire Police to court, arguing that his right to privacy had been violated in a way that caused real, measurable harm. The case reached the High Court in 2018, and the details that emerged during the trial painted an uncomfortable picture of coordination between a police force and a national broadcaster, each apparently prioritizing exclusive coverage over the privacy rights of a man who had not been charged with any crime. In July 2018, the presiding judge ruled decisively in Cliff Richard's favor, finding that the BBC's coverage had been a serious and, in the judge's words, sensationalist breach of his privacy. Both the broadcaster and the police force were found liable, and the financial judgment reflected the seriousness of that finding. General and aggravated damages from the BBC alone totaled well over £200,000, on top of a separate 6-figure settlement from the police and additional payments to cover Cliff Richard's substantial legal costs. Cliff Richard later testified that the entire ordeal, once legal fees and lost professional opportunities were factored in, had cost him millions of pounds. The legal victory was significant, and it went on to influence how UK media law treats suspects who have not been formally charged, largely because Cliff Richard argued publicly that no person's name should be exposed to the public until they are actually charged with crime. But a legal win, however decisive, does not erase 2 years of psychological damage. And Cliff Richard, under oath, described exactly what those 2 years had done to him. During the trial, Cliff Richard gave testimony that went far beyond the financial figures. He described losing a significant amount of weight during the ordeal, not through any deliberate choice, but because sustained stress had worn down his body. He developed shingles, a condition frequently linked to prolonged emotional strain and a weakened immune system. He told the court that at certain points during those 2 years, he genuinely feared he might suffer a heart attack or a stroke. He also described a strange and unsettling experience of looking into a mirror and, for a moment, not recognizing the person staring back. feeling as though an older, more worn version of himself had somehow replaced a man he knew. Sleep offered no escape either. He described lying awake, replaying imagined conversations, and rehearsing outcomes that never happened, caught in loops of anxiety that daylight did nothing to interrupt. Perhaps most tellingly, he never returned to live in the apartment that had been searched. He went back only once, to collect his belongings, and even that visit was difficult. He later compared the experience to having been burgled, except worse, because a burglary at least does not happen in front of a live television audience while the victim watches helplessly from another country. The professional consequences were real, but, in his own account, secondary to the personal toll. An album release was disrupted. A planned update to his memoir was delayed. His charitable work, built over decades, suffered as well. He said afterward that he became acutely aware that people around the world might now associate his name with suspicion, regardless of the outcome of the investigation, and that awareness followed him into rooms and countries where he had once felt only warmth. Even after the Crown Prosecution Service formally cleared him, that feeling did not simply switch off. Public perception, once shaped by a live broadcast watched by millions, does not reverse itself as easily as a legal filing. In the years that followed, Cliff Richard noticeably pulled back from public life. Interviews became less frequent. Appearances slowed. A man who had spent his entire adult life as one of the most recognizable faces in Britain chose, for a period, to become far harder to find. What made the ordeal especially difficult, in Cliff Richard's own telling, was the gap between his private certainty of his own innocence and the public's inability to fully unhear what it had already seen and heard. He has said that knowing he had done nothing wrong did nothing to quiet the physical symptoms of stress, the sleeplessness, or the sense of dread that followed him from country to country as he tried, in fits and starts, to resume touring. A headline retraction or a legal victory does not travel with the same speed or reach as a live helicopter broadcast. For every person who eventually read that the Crown Prosecution Service had dropped the matter for lack of evidence, there were others who only ever saw the original footage and drew their own conclusions from it. That imbalance, more than any single moment in the ordeal, seems to have shaped how Cliff Richard thinks about fame and privacy for the rest of his life. It is part of why he became such a vocal advocate for anonymity ahead of formal charges, arguing that no one should have to live through what he lived through simply because an accusation, however unproven, had already been made public. Long before the 2014 scandal, Cliff Richard's personal life had already become a subject of public fascination, largely because of one persistent fact. He never married, and he has no children. For a man who spent decades as one of the most eligible bachelors in British entertainment, that absence became a defining part of his public story, almost as significant to fans as his music itself. Cliff has spoken at various points about why he chose the path he did. His Christian faith, which deepened significantly after he became a devout believer in the mid-1960s, played a central role. He has said he came to believe that marriage required a level of total commitment that he did not feel he could offer alongside a touring schedule that regularly kept him away from home for months at a stretch. He has also spoken about valuing his independence, describing a genuine contentment in living alone that, for most of his life, did not register to him as loneliness at all. There was also a more pragmatic consideration rooted in his faith. He has said he preferred to avoid marriage altogether rather than risk a divorce that would conflict with his religious convictions. That lifelong bachelorhood inevitably fueled decades of public speculation about his private life, speculation he has consistently dismissed as none of anyone's business. What he has been more open about are the relationships he did have. In the 1970s, he has acknowledged being drawn to the singer and actress Olivia Newton-John, though she was already committed to someone else by the time their paths crossed as friends and occasional collaborators. The two remained close for the rest of her life, and he was reportedly among the people near her in her final days. He was also linked romantically over the years to dancer Delia Wicks and actress Una Stubbs, describing his younger years, in his own words, as having had a fairly eventful romantic life. None of those relationships led to marriage or children. Perhaps the most enduring of his romantic connections was with former tennis champion turned broadcaster Sue Barker, whom he dated in the 1970s. Their romance eventually settled into a long, warm friendship rather than a marriage, and Barker went on to marry someone else while Cliff continued to pour his energy into music. In more recent years, Cliff Richard has spoken with unusual candor about the emotional weight of the choices he made. He has admitted to wondering, particularly in quiet moments after a concert ends and the applause fades, what it might have been like to come home to a family rather than to silence. He had been careful to clarify that this reflection is not about romantic regret. He has had romance in his life, but about something else entirely: the absence of a shared daily domestic life, a spouse, children, the kind of ordinary companionship that exists apart from any stage or spotlight. He does not describe this as regret exactly, but as an honest acknowledgement that the life he built, for all its extraordinary highs, left certain rooms permanently empty. For most of his career, Cliff Richard's greatest asset besides his voice was his stamina. Decade after decade of touring, recording, and public appearances with barely a pause. That stamina has, inevitably, begun to run up against the realities of age. In late 2024, during a routine medical check required for insurance purposes ahead of a planned tour of Australia and New Zealand, doctors discovered that he had prostate cancer. He had not gone looking for the diagnosis. The examination was simply a bureaucratic requirement tied to tour insurance, the kind of paperwork most performers barely think about. Instead, it uncovered something that could easily have gone unnoticed for far longer had he not needed the tour cleared. Fortunately, doctors determined that the cancer had been caught early and had not spread beyond its original location. Cliff kept the diagnosis largely private for roughly a year while undergoing treatment, continuing to perform and tour throughout that period without disclosing what he was privately managing. It was not until December 2025, during an appearance on the ITV program Good Morning Britain, that he told the public what he had been living with. He described the cancer as gone at the moment, but he was careful, almost deliberately cautious, not to declare victory outright, noting that